Moscow, July 21, 1969, the end of the working day. The square at the Nikitsky Gate is crowded, but in the evening rush, no one pays attention to engineer Viktor Buterin, who is leisurely strolling by the cinema, holding the Ogonyok magazine in his hands. At 18:45, another man approached him. He first looked at the movie posters and then turned to Buterin with a question. "Do you happen to know where you can watch the movie Eugene Onegin?" "It's better to listen to Onegin at the Bolshoi Theater," came the reply. It was the password. Like the magazine in his hands, it was one of the signs by which the CIA's deputy resident in Moscow, Frank Smith, identified a new agent who had been recruited a few months earlier. The Americans did not even suspect that Soviet counterintelligence was dragging them into one of the longest operations in the history of the world's intelligence services. At the Lubyanka, she was given the codename Riddle 2. The Soviet Union in the late 60s was significantly inferior to the United States in the arms race. American strategic nuclear missiles have become much more accurate, which has put all Soviet military installations at risk. In order to maintain the ability to strike back in the event of a war, it was necessary to deceive the American target guidance systems. In January 1969, the Council of Ministers adopted a secret decree on the creation of a combat railway missile system, the BZHRK. An entire regiment of intercontinental ballistic missiles, along with a command post, was housed in an ordinary-looking train. Such a composition could produce a salvo capable of destroying, for example, England, wiping it off the face of the earth. Disguised as ordinary freight trains, these missile systems were supposed to constantly run along the country's railways. It would be almost impossible for the Americans to find out which of the hundreds of trains are hiding RT-23 missiles with a firing range of up to 10,000 kilometers. BZHRK has become a real nightmare for U.S. intelligence. The CIA was looking for someone who could get to the secrets of the ghost train, or Train Number 0, as it was conventionally designated on the railways of the Soviet Union. It was then that military engineer Viktor Buterin came to the attention of the CIA. He was suitable for recruitment in all respects. The Americans had different ways of forcing espionage. They could use all kinds of cruel methods of compromise, simply threats or coercion to cooperate using various forms of pressure, as well as physical influence or the use of special drugs. But in the case of Viktor Buterin, everything was much simpler and scarier. According to the CIA, he carefully concealed from the Soviet state security agencies an extremely unsightly secret, the exposure of which threatened him with death. At the same time, he could be very useful to American intelligence as he worked at a military enterprise in Perm, Kuyabych, Vladivostok, Sevastopol, Murmansk. Many famous Soviet cities had the status of closed. Entry for foreigners to them was prohibited. There were military bases and large defense enterprises there. They were only conditionally marked on the maps, and the citizens of the country knew about their existence only by hearsay. Arzamas 16, Tashkent 9, Chelyabinsk 40, Tomsk 7. Such cities were located far from the state borders. Nuclear and space research were conducted there, and a special regime for maintaining state secrets was established. Living in such invisible cities had its pros and cons: a 20% salary increase, virtually zero crime rate, as well as the free sale of many scarce goods. However, for disclosing information about living in such a place, the perpetrator was subject to the strictest liability, including criminal liability. To find out what was hidden behind the walls of such cities, Western intelligence agencies resorted to the variety of tricks. For example, the famous story of the railway container that the Americans sent from Japan to West Germany through the entire territory of the Soviet Union in the 80s. With the help of equipment installed inside, they took readings, for example, from our nuclear facilities past which the train was passing. At the same time, the area along the route was photographed from this container. Western intelligence agencies tried to use the rare cases when the Soviet authorities allowed diplomats to visit closed cities. The intelligence officer, who worked under diplomatic cover, placed special electronic equipment under his clothes, turning into a kind of walking electronics center. But most often, foreign intelligence agencies tried to get an agent among those who worked in closed or top-secret cities. Viktor Butin worked in Perm at a factory that produced elements for combat missile engines, which meant he had valuable information. In addition, the American intelligence services knew that his relative, Kolesnikov, held a high position in the Ministry of Railways and had access to classified information on a wide range of military equipment, train movements, army arsenals, test sites, and so on. The ministry's leadership should have known about the testing of the nuclear train, its future routes and locations. According to his position, Kolesnikov was a member of the circle as follows.
Moscow, November 1969. Major General Grigory Grigorenko becomes the first deputy head of KGB counterintelligence. Starting in September 1970, he will head the second main directorate for 13 years. This period is not called the Golden Decade of counterintelligence for nothing. Grigory Fyodorovich was born in 1918, was a participant in the Great Patriotic War and in the state security agencies since 1942. In the field of counterintelligence, he was a true master of multi-way operations. It is no coincidence that she was given the code name Riddle 2. It was, in fact, a continuation of the large-scale game that the Smersh counterintelligence agencies waged against Germany during World War II. At that time, one of its leaders was State Security Captain Grigory Grigorenko, and the main character was the same Viktor Bucharin. At the end of 1941, Bucharin, who worked in Leningrad, was thrown behind enemy lines but soon fell into the hands of the fascists. He agreed to the offer to cooperate with German intelligence. After some time, he was transferred to Soviet territory as an agent of the Abwehr. Bucharin immediately told about his recruitment to the Soviet counterintelligence officers. In the summer of 1943, Smersh decided to use it in a radio game with the Germans, which was given the name Riddle. Radio games with the Nazis were based on a well-developed scenario. An Abwehr agent with a walkie-talkie was thrown into the Soviet rear and turned over, after which he began to transmit skillfully prepared disinformation to German intelligence. Bucharin informed the Germans that his relative by the name of Kolesnikov holds a responsible post in the People's Commissariat of Railways and possesses crucial information of strategic importance. The Germans checked, and the man with that name was indeed listed in the People's Commissariat. Bucharin was given the task to persuade him to cooperate. The whole radio game Riddle revolved most of the time around the figure of this official. At the end of 1943, Bucharin reported to the Germans that his relative had agreed to provide them with information, but first demanded that he be given an American passport and a large sum in foreign currency. In the spring of 1944, Bucharin handed over to the Germans an allegedly secret plan for Soviet military transportation, from which it followed that the main forces of the Red Army were concentrating on the southern sector of the front. In fact, it was misinformation of strategic importance. On June 23, 1944, the Soviet Army launched a powerful offensive on the central sector of the front in Belarus. This offensive came as a complete surprise to the Germans. After the war, Viktor Bucharin became part of history, and no one even suspected that 25 years later it would resume, only now against the Americans. 1970. Viktor Bucharin handed over his first report to the CIA. He confirmed that during this time his relative Kolesnikov had risen to a responsible position in the Ministry of Railways, told about his work in Perm and about the secrecy regime. It was all a mixture of truth and misinformation. In Operation Riddle 2, it is still unclear how the CIA got to Bucharin. According to one version, this was also part of a clever plan by General Grigorenko. He had a talent for calculating everything 10, 20, or even 100 steps ahead. The counterintelligence officers had to buy time for the engineers and designers, who were working on the creation of the BZHRK, so it was decided to substitute an agent for the American Special Services and transmit disinformation useful to the Soviet side through him, and at the same time find out the CIA's connections and working methods in the Soviet Union. According to some reports, the CIA was able to reach Butyrin using the archive of Reinhard Gehlen, a Wehrmacht lieutenant general who led intelligence on the Eastern Front and surrendered to American troops after the war, handing them a huge amount of data. Gehlen proposed to the U.S. counterintelligence to create a new German intelligence agency that would work against the Soviet Union. At first glance, Butyrin had good reasons to cooperate with the U.S. Special Services. He was constantly threatened with exposure. He made it clear that he would like to leave the Soviet Union, but before that he would earn money for a future life abroad, for which he would sell secret information to the CIA. An interesting detail: Butyrin's first reports began to go to Washington almost simultaneously with the start of work on the creation of the Soviet Ghost Train. Any information about the progress of work on the Soviet BZHRK was of great interest to the Americans, and the KGB counterintelligence tried to take advantage of this by supplying them with a mixture of disinformation and real information. It was one of the objectives of Operation Riddle II to put the American analysts on the wrong track. Moreover, Butyrin's communication channel with the CIA soon became permanent. During these covert operations, the Americans gave him a camera and a radio receiver that was tuned to a specific wave that was broadcast by the intelligence center. Most often the ciphers for Butyrin came from the radio station in Munich or Frankfurt. The Moscow station of the CIA at that time numbered no more than 10 or 11 people.
However, in 1974, the CIA really suspected its agent of playing a double game. During Operation Riddle, a career German intelligence officer was detained, who was sent to the Soviet rear to contact Viktor Butyrin. Sentenced to death by the will of circumstances, this man ended up in a prison camp. In 1955, when the Soviet Union granted amnesty to convicted Germans, he returned to Germany and got a job in West German intelligence. In 1974, the CIA found information in the archives that came to them that he was Butyrin's contact, and decided to talk to him. That's when Viktor was on the verge of failure. The Germans said that at the end of 1944, he saw Butyrin in the company of Soviet counterintelligence officers. This fact greatly alarmed the CIA. Butyrin's messages raised unexpected questions for General Grigorenko. Did Butyrin meet with the contact? What did he tell him? Then Grigorenko decided to be proactive again. On his recommendation, Butyrin feigned mortal resentment at the CIA's distrust. He wrote an emotional message. "You shouldn't trust me at all. I have prepared unique information for you here at a top-secret facility. I'll only put it in the hands of the resident. No hiding places. This information will cost me my head, and I will only hand it over personally." The Americans fell for it. The CIA's deputy resident in Moscow, Frank Smith, the one who first made contact with Viktor at the cinema, was supposed to appear in June of 1976. A scene was supposed to be played out in a second-hand bookstore. One of the visitors allegedly accidentally forgot a book, and the other, who came later, had to ask for it. At this moment, a secret message was supposed to be exchanged, but as soon as the volume with the bill embedded in it was in the hands of Frank Smith, he was immediately detained by the KGB task force. Smith was soon ordered to leave the USSR within 48 hours. It seemed that Operation Riddle II had reached an end, but no. Grigorenko has conceived another non-trivial step. The KGB informed the public about its work. A lecture was held at the Polytechnic Museum, which described how the special services of other states are engaging in illegal activities on the territory of our country. The representative of the State Security Committee who spoke casually reported on the recent arrest of a Soviet citizen at the time of the transfer of classified information to a CIA officer. As a result, the American intelligence officer was expelled from the USSR and his agent got his own. The lecture was attended by representatives of foreign countries, journalists, and students. The sensational information reached the CIA station staff very quickly. If Viktor is behind bars, it means that he is not a KGB agent, and the failure in the bookstore was not his provocation.
In fact, he was not arrested. Butyrin was temporarily withdrawn from Operation Riddle 2, but it continued. June 1977. Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev arrives in Paris on a visit. Both sides carefully prepared for the meeting. The day before, a delegation of Soviet specialists came to France, one of which included Kolesnikov. The American intelligence officers closely followed the preparations for the visit and could not believe their luck. By all accounts, Kolesnikov was Butyrin's relative, whom the Germans had recruited during the war. He was the source of the most important information that Victor had passed on to the CIA in recent years. Frank Smith, who was expelled from the Soviet Union after being detained in a bookstore, approached Kolesnikov at one of the receptions and asked how his relative was doing. Later, they met in private. The Soviet official was very unhappy because his relative, who was carrying out their assignments, was arrested because of him. Kolesnikov made it clear that he was ready to cooperate with the Americans, but demanded a large sum in foreign currency in advance. Smith set a prerequisite. He must pass a polygraph test. The American intelligence officers did not realize that a specially trained officer of the State Security Committee was acting as a high-ranking official. General Grigorenko were sure that Butyrin's main source of information, once abroad, would certainly attract the attention of the Americans. He did not rule out a polygraph test, so the employee was trained in special techniques for deceiving a polygraph. With the proliferation of polygraphs, the KGB conducted research on how to deceive them. For another 6 years, Kolesnikov transmitted false information to American intelligence. In 1983, the KGB decided to curtail Operation Riddle 2. The tasks of protecting Soviet weapons secrets were completed, but General Grigorenko suggested ending the operation with a spectacular finale. Moscow, May 1983. The attaché of the U.S. Embassy, who is actually a CIA officer, Louis Thomas, found a piece of paper in his car. It was a message from Kolesnikov. For their work, the Americans confirmed through him that they were ready to pay the money and informed him of the location of the cash, which would contain the required amount. June 2, 1983.